Hi, these are the notes for today's section. Throughout the video and probably right now, you're going to need to pause this so that you can try practice problems, or in this case, maybe find the right page of your notes. So pause the video, and get out your note card and your notes, and get to the right page. In question 1, we're asked if the triangles are congruent. Actually, we're not really asked if the triangles are congruent. We're asked why they are congruent. And looking at this picture, I see two angles that match with two angles here. And I see a side after them, which means that these two triangles are congruent because of angle, angle, side. What about problem 2b? Well, really 2a. The triangles shown are congruent. I'll tell you yes, they are, and we have to decide why it is. How do we know this? Well, looking over at this one, do you remember that we know vertical angles are congruent? So the triangles are congruent by side, angle, side. There's actually 5 reasons that we know triangles are congruent. I don't want you to write them into problem 3. I actually want you to go to your note card and confirm that you have them there. So why don't you pause this and see if you can find those 5 things on your note card. Is this what you have? If you have any questions about any of them, now is the time to ask someone around you. One of the most common questions is the difference between these two. If you feel comfortable with that, then move on. And we're going to be looking at problem number 4. In problem number 4, we're going to know that we have the triangles congruent. This is actually like that little half sheet you had the other day, where the directions said the triangles are congruent, and then the directions asked you to mark all other parts that would end up being congruent. Well, today, I'm once again telling you the triangles are congruent, but instead of marking them on the picture, I'm asking you to name all the parts that are congruent. So if I know these two triangles are identical, then let's see, I would know angle C has to be congruent to angle D. Pause this now and see if you can figure out the remaining 6. Is this what you have? Well, here's what's going on with these. If you know two triangles are congruent, then there's 2 things that we know. Actually, I wrote the exact same sentence here twice because there's 2 different things that we're going to know. One is that every matching side is going to end up being congruent, and the other is that every matching angle is going to be congruent. Well, I personally, instead of writing out 2 different sentences or saying this twice, instead of saying every corresponding side and every corresponding angle is congruent, I actually just write one statement, and it would look like this. If 2 triangles are congruent, then their corresponding parts are congruent, standing for both sides and angles. Well, now seems like a good time to put a phrase like this onto your note card. This is going to be a very common phrase in a proof. If 2 triangles are congruent, their corresponding parts are congruent. Or if you don't like parts, then you're going to say then their corresponding sides and angles are congruent. All right, pause this so that you can take some time to write that down. So we're going to use that information about 2 triangles being congruent to tell us that we have 2 angles or 2 sides that are congruent. In problem number 7, it's going to be about 2 sides being congruent, and in number 8, it's going to be about 2 angles being congruent. But before I worry about the sides or angles, let's see if I have congruent triangles. In number 7, I see I have a side, angle, and side here that matches a side, angle, and side here. So I know that these 2 triangles are congruent by side, angle, side. And look at what you just wrote up here. If the 2 triangles are congruent, then everything else is going to end up being congruent. So you just have to decide, is this in the right spot? Does AM correspond with RC? And looking at it, yeah, these will be in the right spot. So yes, those are congruent because, and here's your long statement, if triangles are congruent, then their corresponding parts are congruent. Ooh, this is a long statement. Well, let's look at problem number 8. To decide if the angles are going to be congruent, let's first figure out if the triangles are, because if the triangles are congruent, everything else will match up. So if I look at triangle 808, let me mark this reflexive line to kind of help myself here. So it looks like I've got a side, a right angle, and the same thing here. This is RHL. So the triangles are congruent by RHL, which means everything else is going to end up being congruent. Is GOM in the same spot as OGE? Yes, it is. And the reason would be, well, same thing I wrote in the last problem. Let's practice one more like this. Go to problem number 9. Let's see, I see some vertical angles, so let me mark those. There's nothing else that I know in here. I don't know that I have a midpoint. I don't see the word midpoint up here. I don't know bisect. I don't know perpendicular. There's nothing else I know. Everything else I'd have to guess at. And I've only got 2 things, which means maybe these triangles are congruent. I'm not really sure. So maybe DS is congruent to the segment on the other side, but I don't have enough information to determine this. So don't make assumptions. We are not always going to know everything about a triangle. There might be some things that end up not working out. All right, we're going to put this into a proof. In problem number 12, we're given a lot of information. Before we get started on 12, will you draw all of this information into the picture and then start your video up again? I've marked the picture and I've started off the proof. Remember, basically, all of these 3 statements here technically belong down here. This would be my first one, my second one, my third one. The reason I know everything is because they're given. I'm just not taking the time to write all that down. Today I'm going to continue on with the proof. And I can see, looking at this picture, that the triangles are going to be congruent. And the reason that I know that is because I see side angle side showing up here. And as soon as I know that the triangles are congruent, I know everything else is going to be congruent, because if triangles are congruent, then their corresponding parts are congruent. As I said, this is one of the longest lines of your proof. So I think it's good to have on your note card so you can kind of remember the phrasing of it. But don't forget to write down what it is that we're going to actually care about. So all the corresponding parts are congruent, but the only ones I seem to care about in this problem is that angle G would match up with angle N. And then I finish the proof. All right, see how far you can get in problem number 13, and then start up the video when you're ready for that one. Try it on your own first. You got to practice. So how far have you gotten? Did you mark your picture at least? In this problem, you're going to see you're going to have better listening skills than in the other problems, because I'm going to write some of the stuff down, but not all of it. So you can't just copy what I'm writing down. I have drawn onto the picture the stuff I already knew, but let's also add the stuff I'm going to know without any assumptions. Don't I know that XZ is congruent to XZ? That's what would go right here. And the reason is because of reflexive. And as soon as I have that, I can see that the triangles are congruent. Well, that's what I'm going to say in step number 4. Again, you're going to have to write that down. And it's going to be because of side, side, side. And then for the 5th thing, well, if the triangles are congruent, then everything else is going to be congruent. So angle W and Y will end up being congruent, and that would be my reason. So you should have all of this filled in, as well as all of this filled in. After you get all that filled in, try one more problem. We're going to try number 14. Make sure you try to start 14 before you listen to this. What I've done in 14 is drawn what I already know, and then I want to work with this bisect thing. So I'm told BD bisects angle ABC. Here's angle ABC. We're talking about this angle up here is going to get bisected. So remember, when we're talking about the angle being bisected, I don't care about the rest of this. I don't care about this. This is what's getting bisected. This is where it's getting cut, which means that I have two congruent angles going on here. My two congruent angles are going to be the left angle B and the right angle B. So I do not get to simply write angle B is congruent to angle B. You should definitely not have that on your paper. You have to find a way to name the angle B that's on the left and the angle B that's on the right with 3 letters. If you're there, great. If not, take some time to fix that. Is this what you called the angles? What would be the reason that they are congruent? Well, in this problem, again with your listening skills, you are going to have to be writing this down. I'm not going to write it down, but I'll help you out with it. We know that the angle was bisected. Look at your note card, and what does it tell you? You're going to write in a proof for bisect. It should say bisect creates two congruent angles. If it doesn't say that on your note card, I recommend that you write that down. If it does, that's what you're going to write into this line right here. Bisect creates two congruent angles. Well, now let's look at what would happen with the 4th line. Pause this and see if you can figure it out. Did you notice that even though you weren't told anything else, you still know something else? You know BD is congruent to BD, and that's because it's reflexive. Reflexive will only ever be for a segment. So now that I know I have all those parts congruent, it looks like the triangles are congruent because of angle, angle, side. And if the triangles are congruent, well then everything else is going to end up being congruent. And in this problem, I care about AB and BC being congruent. And my reason would be, if triangles are congruent, then their corresponding parts are congruent. All right, you are going to show a completely completed version of this, so that means you should have all this filled in, to the teacher, and then you will be given your worksheet. Good luck!